Welcome back, viewers, and if you are now joining us, you just missed on 90 Seconds News, so don't worry. I am Natalie Seeley Richardson, and we have a lot of guests coming up to have interesting conversations. I want to thank Chanel for, of course, representing well Monday through Thursdays. You always have interesting conversations with Chanel and her guests, and I know she wasn't feeling too well, but she held the fort very well. So thank you, Chanel, and I hope you do feel well soon. Our first guest this morning is Mr. Bishnu Ragoonath, political analyst, and of course a senior lecturer at UWI in the area of political science. And this morning we'll be talking about governance in Trinidad and Tobago, what it really means to you and me as citizens of this republic nation. Good morning, Mr. Ragoonath.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
And of course, this morning I want to start off our conversation in the area of governance. There are some words we use quite often in the public domain, and I think sometimes people don't really grasp, although it may be, a very simple idea. I want us to start looking at governance. What does it really mean when we talk about governance in terms of our country?
Well, you see, this is one of the challenges that we faced in Trinidad and Tobago, and something that we need to look at carefully as we go forward into the future. There are two concepts, government and governance, and many a times we misinterpret and use one interchangeably with the other. It's two different concepts altogether. Government is part of governance, because with government, all you do is you manage the systems to make sure that it is supposed to be working the way you want it to work. Whereas with governance, you are now supposed to be focused on not only managing and operating a system of managing or governing a society, but rather in bringing into play various other issues, such as, for instance, transparency, accountability, ethics, bringing into system the ability of participatory democracy, bringing into system focusing on what is development and where we want to go from here. All of these things are part and parcel of governance. And what we have in Trinidad and Tobago, to a large extent of the time, is we have government, where the government focuses on this is what we're going to do. And because this is what we're going to do, we decide what we're going to do, and we're going to decide, and we're going to tell you how it's going to be done. Are we accountable to you? Yes, they'll say we are accountable every time we have an election, but that's not what accountability means. Accountability means is getting people to understand why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing it. And that is where we fall short many a times, because we don't have that accountability. We don't have transparency. People do things and we don't know why they're doing it. There's a lot of secrecy in government and confidentiality, and we can't tell you this and we can't tell you that because it's confidential. But that undermines governance. No, it focuses on government, but not governance.
Right. And of course, how do we get the mindset? Because we could have this conversation here and we have our viewers who are listening, but you have a lot of people who don't have access to this type of discussion. Where do we start in getting us as citizens to understand that major difference and to hold government accountable for their actions?
This we have started, in when we describe the object quality, and people will know what is to happen to your, what are your responsibilities, and all of those things. We don't have to tell you. We have tried into what is now called studies, social studies, that's on the rights of the citizen and so on. And this is where we need now to go back to communities and start community consultations and so on. Let me give you a simple example about the accountability and transparency issue. In other countries in the world, right here in the Caribbean, in Belize, for instance, any local government, any THA assemblyman would have been required by law, as happens in Belize, that every 3 months they must have a meeting in their local community. We don't have that here. We don't have that here because people just wouldn't be bothered. Um, it's not in the law, and for instance, so in particularly so in Trinidad, I cannot speak so clearly about Tobago, but particularly so in Trinidad. If you ask somebody, when last you see a councillor, when last you see an MP, and they tell you, boy, the last time I saw him was when he was campaigning for election, or when she was went to open something. But beyond that, we don't see them.
Right.
And that is part and parcel of the problem we face is because there's no accountability, there's no reporting back to the people, there's no transparency. We pass laws, and and but do people understand what the laws mean, how it impacts upon them? And the simple answer to that question is no. And if they're looking for their MP or their assemblyman or their councillor to explain to them what that is about, in many instances, those people don't even know. And are they willing to learn to come back and tell and talk to uh, their constituents?
Right.
The answer to that question is no. That's where our shortcomings in governance comes in. How do we get to that stage? Well, we have to start back that culture where people have to want to be involved. We've become too much of a nuclear society now, where we are only concerned about our own business. You know, there was a time when you say the village raises a child,
Yes.
and now you can't tell somebody's child what to do and how to do it because it's not your right. Um, that is where we need to go back to some of those traditional uh, practices and let us get back to speaking and let us get back to focusing on what we need and more importantly then put pressure upon the government, whoever the government is,
Right.
to be accountable and transparent in what they do.
And I think many times as citizens, we fail to realize the power we really have as a people in holding governments, whichever political party is in charge, accountable. I want us also to look at, because when we look at governance, a lot of the times people think of the sitting government, but there are other sectors to governance. I want us to look a little about maybe the role the media has to play, the role the average citizen has to play in when we look at governance.
Well, you see, this is where the whole education drive has to be. And let me just say one of those things that gets missed in the discussion. When we talk about government, and if I go back to government,
Right.
you know, in the case of Tobago, for instance, there's a minority in the Tobago House of Assembly, and there's the majority. Many a times people will tell you, well, look, it's Fali and them in government because them is in government. But the government includes the minority,
Yes.
and people don't appreciate that, or at least our leadership do not expect us to appreciate that the minority is also part of the government because according to the law, according to the constitution, if you don't have a minority, you have a problem in operationalizing the law. So the minority is also part of the government. So when you say you're blaming the government, in the case of Tobago, you're not only blaming Fali Augustine and his uh, members of his cabinet and so on, his executive council. But you are also blaming the minority in the assembly. And that has to be also appreciated. A lot of
Yes.
times we don't do that. And this is where, for instance, you talk about the role of the media. And the role of the media is one that is supposed to be educational and bringing some of these things to the fore. Unfortunately, our media, and it's part of our challenge um, across the country and probably across the region too. Our media are not well informed. Our media representatives are not well informed as to some of these things, and they spread the propaganda and the bad. When I say propaganda, they use terms So when we talked earlier about
Right.
government and governance, and they
Yes.
use these terms interchangeably in the media, and that is what people will understand it to be. And
Correct.
that's where the media has a responsibility and a right and a role to serve in that process of facilitating the educational process and
And
the
and
understanding
even
of the system.
even you mentioned the whole idea as well as when we use the term government, we fail to realize it's those who are in charge and even who makes up the opposition and in Tobago's case the minority. And you mentioned, the media. If you see a headline, you would see government this, and really when you see the term government, they mean those who are sitting in power and not necessarily collectively as those who, are legally representing the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. I hope our viewers are taking it because it's about educating. It's about us understanding what's going on and being informed. So when we hear otherwise, we can make those corrections.
Definitely, and that is where we need to go. And you see, part of the whole process is simply one where people have to understand their roles. And a critical role for the media is to educate. There's the other aspect of it that we tend to simply put little emphasis when we talk about governance, and that is the issue of ethics and integrity. Now, many times I teach ethics and integrity, and I will tell you that several of your several Tobagonian students have participated in my class, and in fact, many of them have asked me, Dr. Ragoonath, why don't you come to Tobago and talk about ethics and integrity? Well, I will go so far to say that I have offered my services
Right.
free of charge to the assembly. Of course, I have not gotten any positive responses, but that's part of the problem. When we want to understand what is ethics, and the simple thing about ethics is not a matter of how you do things. It's how you think and how you put things in place. Integrity is about how you think and how you put things in place,
Yes.
and it is not something about you have to have integrity for one thing and you don't have to have integrity for another thing. Integrity has to be common across the board, and that is part of our challenge when we talk about ethics and integrity in terms of governance, because for many a times our leaders tell us, well, look, me a thief, I know a former uh, politician in Tobago. I sat in his office for about 4 hours one day for him convincing me that I'm not a thief.
Right.
And I said, well, I am not saying that you are a thief, but the point about it is simply the way you do things is not in accordance with proper ethical standards. He says, nothing went into my pocket. I did this and I did that and I did that. And I said, yes. But the question herein is simply, while you did it for the people, were you doing it also for yourself in order that you will get um, voters to support you and so on? And those are questions that I think we need to focus upon. We need to treat with the whole question of ethics and integrity. And I am, unfortunately, while I know for a fact that there are many people in Tobago who have high ethical standards and their integrity is impeccable, the question is here one, whether that transcends across the leadership for those in government and those holding office. And when I say those in government, let me be careful. I'm not only talking about the politicians, I'm talking about the practitioners, down to the clerical person in an office, in a public sector office. They are supposed to operate with ethics and integrity. They are supposed to make sure that everybody is treated equally and so forth. And that is where we have the shortcomings. When people, for instance, tell me, and if I may use an example to illustrate, when somebody tells me, well, you see me, I go to work for, I don't reach work for 8 o'clock, I just reach for 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning. But I just work till my 4 o'clock. And I ask them, I says, in that context, let me ask you something. If you go to the market and you ask for a pound of tomatoes, and the person who's selling it to you says it's 6 tomatoes in the pound but gives you 5, is that ethical? And they say, no, that person thieving me. I say, and you are collecting a day's salary for work for between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m., but you're going to work for 9 o'clock. Are you not doing the same thing that the person in the market is doing? And then they say, no, don't call me a thief. And that's where we now have to start back and ask ourselves, culturally, in our own minds, how do we understand this whole question of ethics and integrity? How do we understand? Is it that some wrong things are okay and some wrong things are bad?
Or it's right depending on who is doing it, and we put all these measures when we look at ethics. And I know that we can continue talking about this for quite a while, but we do have to wrap up now. And I really want to thank you for your time, Mr. Ragoonath, for sharing with us. And again, I hope our viewers really, internalize the information. It's very important for us to understand these issues because we have to make decisions. We have the right to vote, and we put persons in power. And remember, your government is not just those who won the elections, but it trickles down throughout the system. So let's keep that in mind, and we thank you again for spending time with us this morning on GMT. Viewers, we get ready for a break as we prepare for our next set of guests, so stay tuned.
Let's go. It's a brand new morning.